While the introduction of DLC sealed their fate, for a while, the Pokémon games would receive a third version, and that contained all the additional content and updates a modern game would get. These third versions, for the most part, would focus on a different legendary, make additions to the story, and generally become the definitive edition of whatever set of games it belongs to. So, in honor of this retired aspect of the franchise, let's go over the third versions we did get. We start all the way back in Gen 1. Now, for most people, they would just look to Yellow as the third version, but that's not quite the case. It's no secret that the games released as Red and Green in Japan, but they also released a blue version, and this was an updated version of the Red and Green games. The changes were mostly stuff like updates to the Pokémon sprites, as the original Red and Green ones were quite rough, and some overall bug fixes. There's nothing too massive with this one, but it is the first third version, and it deserves to be mentioned. Now, what people are probably expecting, Pokémon Yellow, the fourth version. After the boom of the Pokémon anime, they released Pokémon Yellow, a version of the Gen 1 games that's a lot more in tune with the anime. Instead of choosing your starter, you get given a Pikachu, and it even follows you around in the overworld. This is probably the biggest change, as your starter is not just a Pokémon, it's also a character in the story, given how much you can interact with it and how it interacts with the story. While probably the biggest, it's far from the only change. You can still receive each of the 3 Kanto starters throughout your journey, in similar places and times to when Ash received his. Jessie and James of Team Rocket are also in the game, showing up numerous times trying to thwart you along the way. The Pokémon not obtainable to you are also inspired by the anime, such as Weedle is missing due to Ash having caught a Caterpie, and the main aces of Jessie and James also being unobtainable. This version also gives us the Pikachu surfing minigame, which requires your Pikachu to learn Surf, which is only learnable through Pokémon Stadium, so you're going to need some extra tech, unless you're on Virtual Console where you can just play the minigame no matter what. In the next generation, we got Gold and Silver, and then ultimately Crystal. And it's a very interesting one, even in just a physical sense. While Gold and Silver are Game Boy Color Enhanced, they're still technically original Game Boy games, but Crystal is exclusive to the Game Boy Color. This game also focuses on Suicune as its box legendary, and that in of itself is special, as it's part of a trio separate from the box legends on the original pair of games, and itself is a sub-legendary. Crystal also introduced a mainstay feature of the franchise, and that is the ability to play as a girl. Every game beforehand only had the option to play as a boy, but now you have 2 different genders to choose from. Some areas like the Dragon Den and the Ice Path get completely revamped and redesigned visually. And also, while on original hardware, it was only available in Japan through a mobile phone connection. The Virtual Console release has access to it no matter when and no matter what your region is. And that is that Crystal had the first ever in-game event for a mythical Pokémon, being Celebi. You would receive the GS Ball, and it would allow you to go into the forest to catch Celebi for yourself. You can even shiny hunt it if you do so desire. While Yellow was a different experience, Crystal is the first time you can call a third version the definitive edition of a set of games. In Generation 3, we got Ruby and Sapphire, and then eventually Emerald. Emerald has the biggest change thus far, and that's coming with the evil teams. Ruby had Team Magma as the main antagonist, while Sapphire had Team Aqua. Emerald, instead of choosing one or the other, combined both so you are actively taking on both teams throughout the story. This is also the first third version to have the final member of a box art trio as the focus, this time being Rayquaza, who is kind of just hidden in a corner of Ruby and Sapphire, but is now the main focus. And you can still get Groudon and Kyogre if you do desire. They also introduced a whole new post-game area. Where Ruby and Sapphire had just the Battle Tower, Emerald expands it to the Battle Frontier, an area with 7 different battle facilities, all with different rule sets that challenge you. This change also comes with Scott, the owner of the Battle Frontier, who you'll run into throughout your journey, especially since the contest halls that used to be spread out across the region have been replaced with the battle tents. And now Lily Cove is the only place you can do contests. Also, one of the more shocking surprises is that the champion actually changed between Ruby and Sapphire and Emerald. In the originals, it was Steven, but in Emerald, you find that he has passed the title of champion to Wallace, who was once the 8th gym leader. And so now, who is the final gym leader in Hoenn? Well, it's none other than his mentor, Juan. This was such a fun little change just to spice things up a little bit between having to replay the same story a few times. Diamond and Pearl, the first games to release on the Nintendo DS, are a bit rough when you look back on them. At the time, they seemed fine, but once you play Platinum, these games feel like a beta release. Platinum ushers in a much sleeker UI, fixes some of the slowness issues the game had, such as the abysmally slow surf speed, increases the variety of Pokémon. Where Diamond and Pearl didn't even include all the new Pokémon in its regional decks, Platinum remedies this by having them all available in the story. There's even a lot of visual upgrades on the map. Having more snow on the map throughout the region, the galactic buildings feel more sinister, and even the inside of the Pokémon League feels more thematically tight. Platinum also gives a bunch of new forms to Pokémon. Giratina obviously gets the new Origin form. but Shaman gets the Sky form and Rotom gets a whopping 5 new forms. The latter two are unfortunately locked behind long-gone events, unless you use fan servers to download them. Platinum also brings back the Battle Frontier, although it's dropped down to only 5 facilities. The playable characters in the game also get updated designs to reflect the new colder climate by having jackets and scarves. A few of the gyms received updates to their puzzles, such as the infamous math puzzle in Fantina's gym now being more thematic to the ghost typing. Speaking of, Fantina is now the 3rd gym you face instead of the 5th, shaking up the pacing of the story a bit. To shake it up even more, during the climax of the story where Cyrus summons a box legendary Pokémon, he now summons both Dialga and Palkia, only to be thwarted when Giratina shows up and drags everyone into the all-new Distortion World. A realm where laws of reality are bent to the extreme, and you can catch Giratina in its home reality. Moving on from this, the 3rd version doesn't really exist anymore. Black and White, instead of getting a 3rd version like Gray, got full-on sequels. While the sequels are heavily based on the originals, they feature a completely new story, multiple new areas, and so on and such forth. While they fill in the role of the 3rd version in terms of the release cycle, they are such completely different beasts. Gen 6 didn't see any 3rd versions, and in Gen 7 we see the Ultra games. Sun and Moon didn't receive a 3rd version, but a whole-on secondary set of games that have changes comparable to a 3rd version. They're mostly the same games, but with some new forms, characters, and a bit of extra post-game, slight changes to the story. I could go on and list the differences like with the others, but this is such a different scenario, for it's not just a single release, it has all the differences that a paired games have normally. And that brings us to modern day, where we still don't see 3rd versions release at all. Instead, the games have shifted to a DLC format, so all the new content is focused on these new experiences instead of being sprinkled throughout the story. It serves a similar use, more content for the same game, but with the bonus of not having to replay the story to access it. Some people may prefer one or the other, and that's fair. I enjoy the concept of having a definitive edition of a game, not having to worry about missing out on things such as quality of life updates and content. But on the other hand, not having to replay the game to get access to the new content is very much appreciated, not having to lose my progress to venture into these new story beats and post-game activities. Well, I think that's most of what I wanted to talk about. It is far from every change made in these 3rd versions, as this is more just the bigger points that have stuck to my mind throughout the years. Well, if you made it this far, I would like to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or even subscribing, as both of those truly do help out the channel. Also, I would love to hear from you in the comments down below, even if it's just what your favorite change made in the 3rd version was, or whether you prefer getting a 3rd version or DLC. If you want to further support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. Doing so grants you some perks such as having your name appear on screen right about now in future videos. With that said, this is Big Blast 99, and I hope you all have yourselves a goddamn good one.